you. So I am going to follow Alex's advice from this morning, and I'm going to tell you folks a story. It is a story about aviation, but it is not a plane crash. Exactly. We're not going to talk about anything gory or anything like that, so if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, don't worry, you can still hang out with us. And you'll be fine here. So specifically, the kind of story I'm going to tell you is what Dave Woods and Richard Cook would call the second story, where the first story is a really kind of shallow view that, while technically isn't wrong, sort of misses the point. Do you ever feel that way? Like you read like a movie description on Netflix or something, and you're like, I guess, except no, that's not really what happened. And that happens with our incidents so often. We hear this first story. And the first story, if you've heard this one before about the Air Canada flight called the Gimli Glider, you may have heard that this was a unit conversion error that happened. Well, that's not wrong. There's a lot of other fun stuff that we can take a look at and that we kind of miss out on by just saying this is a unit conversion error and we're done. So we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about this initial flight, flight 143. So it kind of started before the day of the actual flight. So the day before, there's this 767 Boeing, and they'd been having trouble. So much trouble that Boeing actually issued a notification and said our FQIS, which is a fuel quantity indicator sensor, basically the wiring that lets the gauges know how much fuel is in the plane. They were so unreliable, Boeing issued a thing that said, you should probably be looking at these every time that you're doing your inspection. And so this technician, Conrad Deremko, he is doing this. And he finds an issue. And he writes it down in the logbook. And so, fortunately though, he was able to fix this. He had actually run into this a few weeks ago. So he goes, oh, I know what to do. And what he ends up doing is he goes and he takes, there are some fuses that have each of these, the FQIS are supposed to be redundant. Notice that it's supposed to be. We'll find out why that isn't true in a moment. There are two channels. The idea was that if one channel doesn't work, the other kicks in, you're down one gauge, but you still have a working one, no problem. It turns out that in some cases, they don't actually fail over, but he had the workaround. He actually turns off one of the channels, the one that was giving him trouble, and tapes it out and puts a tag on it that just says C logbook. He knew this cool workaround, and so he leaves it out, and he gets it up and running, and he sees there is a working gauge, so good to go. The next day, when the flight is getting ready to start, he tells the captain, John Weir, he tells him, hey, we had this problem. Kind of here's what's going on, but we got one gauge. What happens when you don't have both gauges is you have to do what's called a drip stick reading. And you have to do this conversion because depending on how you think of like the fuel and where you are in the process, the fuel management computer, it wants kilograms, but you might be measuring fuel differently. It might be volume that gets pumped into the plane, which doesn't seem too bad, except the 767 happens to be the very first metric plane in Canada. So there's not a lot of practice in doing this conversion, this drip stick reading, but fortunately they managed to figure it out. They do the manual process, and they are able to confirm, based on the one working gauge, that yes, we believe it's right because we arrived at the number on the gauge. And that's something that we do also in software. Our context around what we can confirm, what we think we know, is affecting how we look at that gauge. We can often think of our dashboards as objective. My Grafana dashboard, it's just a number. It's just a gauge. It can't have an opinion. And it may not have an opinion, but it does have a context. And that context can vary depending on who's looking at it. So you and I could look at the same dashboard, come to wildly different conclusions. But they were able to get it going. Captain John Weir and his first officer, Donald Johnson, they fly to Toronto. They do the dripstick thing again, matches up again, take on some fuel, good to go. They make it to Montreal. So they do a handoff. If you've been in any sort of incident, this probably feels familiar for you. Captain Pearson, who's going to take over along with his first officer, Quintal, they're going to fly on to Ottawa. They all kind of have a handoff session, and they talk about a gauge problem. He says, there's this issue with the gauges. And later, the investigation would debate. Different people would say different things about what this conversation actually was. But Pearson walked away thinking that the gauges were not functional. Notice gauges. So he believes that this plane has just been flown with completely blank gauges. He's somewhat aware of this manual process to fuel them, so he probably doesn't think too much about it. What happens when you do a transfer like this is not only do you have that conversation, you go into the cockpit in the front of the plane, and both you, your first officer, and any of the maintenance techs at kind of different stages, they're going to be looking at the logbook, kind of like how we might look at logs. So the avionics tech, Uliyev, he heads into the cockpit, and this is the log that he finds. I think that we've all seen some similarly cryptic logs. And so he sees this, and he understands that there is a fuel quantity indicator. It's blank. He sees that channel 2 is at fault. And he's confused by this because he actually just got some really cool training about these sensors. And the training told him that if one channel fails, the other will kick in. So there should be no problem. Why is this in the logbook saying that it's blank instead of it having failed over? So he goes on and he decides to do a self-test that comes with these sensors. There's a way to make them do some sort of diagnostic and tell you a little bit about what's going on. So he figures out it's bad, and he gets distracted, though, after the self-test, and he doesn't restore that workaround that we talked about, that tape. At this point, he probably doesn't even understand why it was there, because, again, he was just trained that they are redundant. And redundancy is good, right? Well, there was actually not redundancy in the sense of there were no spare parts. Air Canada had previously done some math. They'd done some math with Boeing, and they said, well, based on your 12-plane fleet, you really should have one backup processor. So they did. And then they sent it to France. And they sent it to France so that they could develop a repair program. Sounds reasonable. And this is weeks before. They sent it July 13th. Or they sent it before that and then returned to Canada on July 13th. And they realized that when they get it back, it's broken, just like all the others so far. So they don't have a spare. They'd previously been loaned one. It might sound kind of strange, but between all these different airlines, there's actually a lot of loaning of these parts kind of back and forth. So this is one of the first times that we see redundancy is actually creating complexity. When we thought about the system initially, we may have said, oh, it's redundant, that's great. But now this redundancy is creating complexity, confusion. The things that we thought were going to help us are actually seeding the incident. They're helping advance this problem. They actually ended up sending that faulty one to Honeywell, the company who made these. And Honeywell promptly returned it. No, I'm just kidding. They actually gave it back to them, repaired next year. So definitely not in time to help them. So yeah, what about that failover? He had the training, told him one of the channels failed, the other should take over. Probably made it easier for him to get distracted by the fuel truck because there's redundancy. This mental model that he developed, good, but it did not help him. And so we might say, okay, well, what if there was, and a lot of times after an incident, we say, well, what if there was some sort of checklist, right? I mean, anytime you have an aviation incident, isn't that what we all say, like as SREs and stuff like that? We say, well, what if there were checklists? Now, I will say I am not an aviation expert. My background is in software development and as an SRE for a long time. And my previous career was in EMS. So I am not an aviation expert, but I have studied pretty much every single page of documentation that had come out of this incident. But if you want to hear about incident response from the EMS perspective, stick around for Julia's talk on day 3. But I think that's really common. We say, well, what do these other industries have? Oh, if we only had a checklist, if only the documentation was better. Well, great. They have a checklist. One of the checklists is called the MEL, the Minimum Equipment List. It is a list of minimum equipment. It is everything that you must have in order to fly. There's this kind of understanding, though, amongst a lot of pilots at Air Canada, that maintenance can override this. That there is, if they have a problem, they're on the runway, they can radio in, talk to maintenance. Maintenance will come back and say, yes or no, you're going to fly. Now, this sounds sensible. I mean, the pilots, they know a lot, but they don't know the plane the same way the maintenance folks do, right? This happens to us, too. I'm on call for this system. It is touching yours. I go to you, and you tell me, like, is it yours? I have to believe you. That's all I have. It turns out that isn't exactly true. And then on top of that, some of their things that were meant to produce logs, meant to produce something that we could look at after the incident, flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder, well, later when they would run out of power, those didn't work either. So far we have all these things that we thought were going to help us sort of working against us. And this is the slide that tends to upset people. You cannot document your way to safety. Documentation can help support that context building. It can help support system understanding, new things like that. There is no amount of documentation that can guarantee you safety. A lot of you folks have probably seen it. If you want to, sleep, if you do incident reviews and they're kind of too cursory and you found yourself falling asleep, just wake up and go, we should add to the run book. You'll always be right. Technically true. But you cannot document your way to safety. That won't work. The pilot, he did not come on board and be like, oh, crap, flight for dummies. Let me read the documentation. Oh, I'm good to fly. That's not what happened. So now we move on to our incident investigation. Now, we have an issue with this incident investigation in that it was a court that did it. In a way, it was actually the Air Safety Board that later became the agency it is today in Canada. But the person who ended up writing the report and doing this thing is a judge. So they have the board, lawyers, and everyone that they can get involved. They go and they tour Boeing's plant. They visit Honeywell because they made these things. But when the crash investigators, or airline investigators, since we didn't have a crash, went out and talked to people, we later learned what they did is record the conversation. Cool, great. And then they gave that recording to someone else to summarize. And then they took that summary, and everyone who saw that summary after thought it was a transcript of the tape. You know, we totally never lose resolution in our metrics and think that we're seeing everything. That never happens. It's fine. They said the witness, because again, we're in court, the witness was being examined from what everyone assumed to be an accurate transcript of the tape. It was nothing of the kind. Now, I don't know about you, but I have felt that way about dashboards. You are lying to me. I thought this was an accurate transcript of what happened. It was nothing of the kind. Happens all the time to me. I think you folks can understand that. And the witness in this case was actually one of the pilots, so probably not where we want to lose resolution, but they do discover that they had. Now, the big factor in all of this is expertise. The reason it wasn't a crash is because as they are up in the air, they discover, because of that unit conversion error, they took on half the amount of fuel that they needed. What happens when you only take on half the amount of fuel? You get about halfway to your destination. That's what happened in this case. They actually took on, I think, 45%, made it about halfway. They later describe the pilots, they hear this bong in the cockpit. And it turns out that they've never heard that before. No one had. That's because that noise means all engines out. So, of course they hadn't heard it before. It hadn't happened before. Now, we actually find ourselves, as we ride along with these pilots, in a very fortunate position. Expertise, like in so many of our incidents, is what lets us be adaptable. It's what lets us kind of save the day or mitigate the incident, whether or not people will be able to see it. You may have noticed there's sort of a theme throughout. At each stage, we could say, this was success, or this was failure. They ran out of fuel. Failure, right? But I spoiled it for you and said they don't crash. Success, right? Same incident. So when we look at these systems, it's not simple just to say we succeeded or we failed. And in this case, we had just the right level of expertise. Pearson was actually a glider pilot in his spare time. It was a hobby. So once they realize that they are out of fuel, the engines are not running, they try to do some stuff to figure out, because one engine ran out of fuel first. They think they're doing a single engine failure. They realize they've lost both. They quickly look for the documentation for this event. It does not exist, because this is not supposed to happen. I don't know about you, but that seems to happen a lot to me at 3 a.m. This was never supposed to occur, and yet here I am, angry and tired. So they end up in a situation where the plane has hydraulics. And so you cannot actually operate the plane without it. They've lost electrical power, but there's a little kind of RAM error thing that pops out, and the error as it goes by lets them still operate the hydraulics. They realize at this point that they need to land. Part of the problem, though, is the way you normally fly a jetliner, and the maneuvers you would normally do mean that as you attempt to go lower and lower, they would gain forward momentum. Kind of the opposite of what you want as you approach the ground, preferably not faster. Now, because he was a glider pilot, he learned this cool thing called a forward slip. He basically turns one of the controls one way, other controls the other way. This had never been done in a jetliner before, but it works. He is now able to begin descent and not gain forward momentum. Of course, during this time, they're on the radio, expanding the incident, telling everyone, what's wrong, what happened. And they're talking to an air traffic controller, and they're trying to find places that they can make it. At this point, because they don't have power, they also don't have a speed indicator. So they don't actually know how fast they're going. So that's going to make it really hard for them to land. But they do realize, based on their rough estimate of what they knew before they lost everything, that there is no place that they can reach that their air traffic controller is telling them to go. There is no physical way they can make it to any emergency airport that air traffic control tells them. But his first officer, because we have that expertise, happened to serve in the Air Force. And he actually served at this base. There's this base, Gimli. I mean, Air Force bases have landing strips. It's closer than anything ATC can tell us. So they turn and start to head for ATC. Or for Gimli, because they can't go to where ATC says them. And they begin to descend and are doing their best. At this point, I think the situation looks very familiar. Their backup plans have failed. Those emergency operations that we said last time, we updated the run book. When's the last time you actually did this? Maybe one time at 3 in the morning. Or you look at that Confluence page, last updated 5 years ago. Documentation is misunderstood, so this is the situation they're in. And they begin to descend. And they approach Gimli. And they are very close to Gimli when they realize it is no longer an Air Force base. Oops. It was the runway they're counting on was sold off to the private sector. It is a racetrack. It is a drag racetrack now. Partly they know this because there's a race going on. There are crowds by the side watching the cars in the middle. Now, one of the things that makes it a drag racetrack is instead of having that really nice, wide, clear runway, there's a metal rail in the middle of it. It is no longer a landing strip in any sense of the word. But they are able to begin descent and radio down and communicate with people and try to get them out of the way. Now, if you remember, they don't have engines, which means they're very quiet. Later, there are people who are going to report that they did not see the jetliner until it was next to them. There are a couple of photos that survive of bicyclists going past them, not noticing them because it's silent. Despite all of this expertise, though, there was blame. It is, on the basis of all surrounding circumstances outlined in the evidence, to a certain extent understandable. It was not, nor could it be, justifiable in any circumstance. I don't know about you, I don't really like that. They did a great job, but I don't like it, so bad. Pearson was demoted for 6 months. His first officer, suspended for 2. And yet, again, we're back to success or failure. Because again, they didn't crash. Success or failure. They got suspended, got demoted, and of course, like we said, it depends on context. It depends on who you ask, because there's a group that basically in French translates the World Air Sports Federation. They would give both of them the first diploma for outstanding airmanship, the highest award that they created just for these 2 people, essentially. Later, National Geographic would actually make a TV show, kind of investigating different incidents, and this was one of them. And they took a bunch of pilots and put them in a simulator in Vancouver, and they all crashed. But these people did not, and yet suspended, success or failure. So we get to close to the end of our incident. That ram turbine controls hydraulic power. What that means is, as you go slower, the plane is harder to control. But you want to go slower so that you can land. And I think sometimes a lot of our tools do this to us. We end up in this conflicting position of goals and rules and all these sorts of things that kind of work at cross purposes. Better, faster, cheaper, right? Also, because they don't have power, they now decide they need landing gear to land. Sounds reasonable. They do what's called a gravity drop. Really fancy term for opening the door and letting it fall. Literally all it is. There's no other control available. The hydraulics don't do it, so they just drop it. Now, the nose wheel, though, the back ones are fine. The nose wheel does not lock. Oops. Success or failure. They're getting very close to the ground. They've got some landing gear. They've reduced their speed. They've managed to not hit any cyclists. Success or failure. That nose wheel, it didn't lock. But it turns out that when Pearson puts the plane down for the very first time, he brakes so hard, he blows out 2 of the tires. And the plane essentially bounces and then begins to drag. That bounce, for one, will end up locking the nose gear. Success or failure. He dragged the plane on the ground, but he locked the nose gear. He dragged the plane, which it turns out was key to slowing down enough so that the plane did not enter the crowd. Success or failure. Now, it turns out that they managed to bounce it, get the nose wheel in, and I will not keep you in suspense. They do this. They managed to stick it just over the railing. They basically hang the landing gear just over that rail, having slowed down, missing the crowd. Looks like this from head-on. These are photos from that the FAA had. I don't know if I don't think they originally took them, but these are photos they had. You can see there was a race in progress. They managed to end up just there. There were no serious injuries. Everyone walked away. There was no real consequence that we think of when we think about what this could have been. And depending on who you asked, this was a total failure. They ran out of fuel halfway through. And yet, not only did they land this plane, they did so little damage to this plane, it would get repaired and fly for 25 more years before getting retired. Success or failure. So I'm on the side of expertise. I consider this a success. Humans who have this sort of expertise, who have this ability to adapt in this way that was never in the manual, are the reason our systems can be resilient. They did use the monitoring that was available, despite it misleading them. And so they were able to still succeed, though. And I think that's really the position of our tools. We have to consider what the human context is. We have to understand that the humans who will ultimately use this are the important part of the system. They are the resilient and only part that can be resilient in this whole socio-technical system. And I will post these slides if you want to, steal some cool photos or something. I will post them in the Slack for you. Thank you.
Definitely not helping my irrational fear of flying whatsoever. Maybe I'll just take the train home to Boston. It'll only take me about 4 days. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions before we wrap up. Got one back here. How many passengers were on board?
I don't recall. I'll have to get back to you. I can tell you they were gliding forward for 17 minutes after they ran out of fuel, and then there were many passengers aboard. I can find out the exact number for you. I don't remember that part. 61. There you go. Thank you.
So the internet's working. All right. Any other questions? I got one right here.
How did they get the plane back up?
They ended up...
Oh, sorry. How did they get the plane back out?
Back out. So they ended up basically towing it there was a very close-ish repair facility, and they were able to kind of tow it there. Airliners, because they have to fly, are not as heavy as you might think. I mean, they are, but they were able to move it. It went to a local repair facility and then on to a national repair facility where it was slightly repaired and then recertified.
All right, well, in the interest of time, I think we're going to wrap it up here today. Again, let's give another big round of applause to Ty.